This happened to me when I was 19 years old, driving back from college during winter break. It was around 11 p.m. on a particularly cold December night in rural Montana. The snow was coming down hard, and visibility was getting worse by the minute. I was driving along this desolate stretch of highway when I saw a figure on the side of the road. As I got closer, I could make out a woman in her 30s, wearing what looked like a thin jacket and jeans. She was shivering violently and waving her arms frantically. My first instinct was to keep driving. You hear all these stories about hitchhikers, right? But seeing her standing there in the freezing cold, I couldn't just leave her. I pulled over and rolled down my window. She quickly approached my car, her teeth chattering as she spoke. Her name was Thea, and she told me her car had broken down about 5 miles back. She said she'd been walking for over an hour and was starting to get frostbite. She seemed genuinely desperate, and I could see her hands were already turning blue. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the doors and let her in. She immediately thanked me profusely, rubbing her hands together to warm them up. She directed me to take her to the next town, which was about 20 miles away. As we drove, she told me about how she was driving to visit her sick mother when her car just died. She seemed normal enough, just grateful to be warm. But then, about 10 minutes into the drive, something changed. She stopped talking mid-sentence and just stared straight ahead. When I asked if she was okay, she didn't respond. She just sat there, completely still, like she was in some kind of trance. I tried talking to her again, but it was like she couldn't hear me. Then, very slowly, she turned her head toward me. Her eyes were completely different. They were wide, almost bulging, and there was this strange smile on her face that made my skin crawl. She started laughing, not a normal laugh, but this low, guttural sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. It got louder and more intense, and I realized she wasn't blinking. She just kept staring at me with those terrifying eyes while making this horrible laughing sound. I was starting to panic. I tried to stay calm and asked her what was wrong, but she just kept laughing and staring. Then she started rocking back and forth in her seat, and the laughing turned into this weird humming sound. I was looking for a place to pull over when she suddenly grabbed the steering wheel. She yanked it hard to the right, and we almost went off the road. I managed to regain control, but she kept trying to grab the wheel again. I'm screaming at her to stop, but she's not responding to anything I'm saying. She's just making these strange noises and trying to crash the car. I had to use one hand to hold her back while trying to drive with the other. Finally, I saw a gas station up ahead. It was closed, but there were lights on outside. I pulled in as fast as I could and slammed on the brakes. Okay? She immediately stopped what she was doing and sat back in her seat like nothing had happened. Okay? She looked at me with completely normal eyes and said, "Thank you so much for the ride. This is perfect." Then she got out of the car and walked toward the gas station like everything was totally normal. I sat there for a few minutes, trying to process what had just happened. I was shaking and covered in sweat. I watched her walk around to the back of the gas station and disappear into the darkness. I waited another few minutes, then decided to drive to the next town to find a police station. When I got there, I told the officer on duty what had happened. He took down my information and said he'd check it out. The next morning, he called me. He said they'd found a woman's body behind that gas station. She'd been dead for at least 3 days, frozen solid. The description matched the woman I'd picked up perfectly, but here's the thing that still haunts me. The officer said they'd also found a car about 5 miles back from where I'd picked her up. It had been there for over a week, and the plates were registered to the same woman they'd found dead. I never told anyone else about this story until now. I still don't understand what happened that night, and honestly, I don't want to. I just know that whatever I picked up on that highway wasn't entirely human. This story was told to me by my uncle, who was a long-haul trucker for over 30 years. He's seen a lot of weird stuff on the road, But this incident from the late 80s is something he still can't explain. He was driving through Nevada on Interstate 80, somewhere between Reno and Salt Lake City. It was around 2 a.m. and he hadn't seen another car for miles. The road was completely empty, which wasn't unusual for that time of night in the middle of nowhere. He was starting to get tired and was looking for a place to pull over for a few hours when he saw someone walking along the shoulder. It was a young guy, maybe in his 20s, wearing dark clothes and carrying a backpack. My uncle pulled over and rolled down his window. The guy jogged up to the truck and asked if he could get a ride to the next town. He seemed polite and normal, maybe a little tired. My uncle figured he was just another drifter trying to get somewhere, so he let him climb into the passenger seat. The guy introduced himself as Mark and said he was traveling cross-country. He seemed friendly enough, asking about the trucking business and making small talk about the weather. My uncle didn't think anything was unusual about him. They drove for about an hour, just chatting about random stuff. Mark seemed genuinely interested in hearing about life on the road. I asked a lot of questions about my uncle's family, where he lived, what routes he usually took. Normal conversation, nothing that seemed suspicious. But then Mark started asking more specific questions. He wanted to know exactly where my uncle lived, what his house looked like, if he lived alone. When my uncle asked why he was so curious, Mark just laughed and said he was thinking about becoming a trucker himself. The questions got more personal. Mark wanted to know about my uncle's wife, what she looked like, what her daily routine was. He asked if she worked, what time she got home, if she had any hobbies. My uncle started feeling uncomfortable, but didn't want to seem rude. Then Mark pulled out a small notebook and started writing things down. When my uncle asked what he was doing, Mark said he was just taking notes about the trucking lifestyle. But my uncle could see he was writing down everything they talked about: his address, his wife's name, her work schedule. My uncle told him to put the notebook away, that he didn't appreciate being questioned like that. Mark apologized and put it back in his backpack, but the damage was done. The atmosphere in the truck had completely changed. They drove in silence for a while, but my uncle couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. He kept glancing over at Mark, who was now staring out the window with this strange smile on his face. Then Mark started talking again, but this time it was different. He began describing my uncle's house in perfect detail, even though he'd never seen it. He knew about the blue shutters, the rose bushes in the front yard, the squeaky porch step. He even knew about the hidden spare key under the fake rock. My uncle was getting genuinely scared now. He asked Mark how he knew all this information, but Mark just smiled and said he was good at remembering details. Then he started describing my uncle's wife, down to the mole on her left shoulder, and the way she liked to sit by the window while drinking her morning coffee. The worst part was when Mark started talking about my uncle's route schedule. He knew exactly when my uncle would be home and when he'd be away for days at a time. He knew which weeks my uncle's wife would be alone in the house. My uncle realized he had to get this guy out of his truck immediately. He saw a truck stop coming up and said he needed to take a mandatory break. Mark didn't seem to care. He just kept smiling and staring out the window. When they pulled into the truck stop, my uncle expected Mark to get out, but he didn't move. He just sat there, still smiling. My uncle told him this was where he was getting off, but Mark said he was comfortable and wanted to keep riding. My uncle got out and walked around to the passenger side. He opened the door and told Mark he needed to get out right now. Mark finally complied, but as he was climbing down, he leaned close to my uncle and whispered something that made his blood run cold. He said, "I'll be seeing you real soon. Give my regards to your wife." My uncle watched Mark walk away into the darkness behind the truck stop. He immediately went inside and called his wife, telling her to lock all the doors and windows and not to let anyone in. Then he called the police. When he got home 2 days later, his wife told him she'd been getting strange phone calls. Someone would call and just breathe heavily, then hang up. She'd also noticed someone had been going through their trash and that the spare key was missing. They changed all their locks and got a security system installed. My uncle also changed his route schedule so it would be less predictable. They never saw Mark again, but for months afterward, my uncle's wife would see someone watching the house from across the street. The police never found Mark, and my uncle never picked up another hitchhiker. He still wonders what would have happened if he hadn't gotten that guy out of his truck when he did. This story comes from someone named Derek, who was 28 when this happened. Derek was a long-haul trucker, one of those guys who preferred the midnight runs because the roads were clearer and there were fewer four-wheelers to deal with. He'd been driving professionally for about 6 years, hauling everything from electronics to furniture across state lines. The solitude suited him perfectly, just him, his CB radio, and endless stretches of highway. Most drivers hated the isolation, but Derek found it peaceful after spending his 20s working crowded factory floors where supervisors constantly breathed down his neck. On this particular night in early November, Derek was heading east on Interstate 80 through Nebraska, pulling a trailer full of appliances, bound for Chicago. He'd left Sacramento around noon and planned to drive straight through with just fuel stops and mandatory rest breaks. The route was familiar. He'd run this same corridor dozens of times, and he knew every truck stop, way station, and rest area between California and Illinois. It was around 2:30 a.m. when Derek spotted someone walking along the shoulder about half a mile ahead. His headlights picked up the figure gradually as he approached, and he could see it was a man in his 30s wearing a flannel shirt and jeans, carrying what appeared to be a military-style duffel bag. The guy had his thumb out and was walking backward against traffic, the classic hitchhiker pose. Derek rarely picked up riders. Company policy strictly prohibited it, and his insurance wouldn't cover any incidents involving unauthorized passengers. But something about this situation nagged at him. They were in the middle of absolutely nowhere. The nearest town was probably 40 miles in either direction. The temperature had dropped below freezing, and there wasn't another vehicle in sight on either side of the highway. Derek slowed his rig and pulled onto the shoulder about 100 yards past the hitchhiker. Through his side mirror, he watched the man hurry toward the cab, jogging with his duffel bag bouncing against his hip. When the guy reached the passenger side, Derek rolled down his window. The hitchhiker looked up at him with relief written all across his face. He was younger than Derek had initially thought, maybe mid-20s, with shaggy brown hair and several days' worth of stubble. His clothes were rumpled like he'd been sleeping rough, and his boots were caked with dried mud. "Hey man, thanks for stopping," the hitchhiker called up to him. "Name's Travis. My truck broke down about 10 miles back near the Ugala exit. AAA can't get out here until morning, and I'm trying to get to North Platte to catch a bus. Any chance you're heading that direction?" Derek knew North Platte was right on his route, about 2 hours down the road. Against his better judgment and company policy, he told Travis to climb up. Travis hauled himself into the passenger seat with surprising agility, settling his duffel bag between his feet. As they pulled back onto the highway, Derek tried to get a read on his unexpected passenger. Travis seemed friendly enough, thanking Derek repeatedly for the ride and explaining how he'd been stuck on the roadside for over 3 hours before Derek came along. The conversation flowed naturally at first. Travis mentioned he was a construction worker between jobs, traveling to meet up with the crew in Iowa. He asked Derek about life on the road, seemed genuinely interested in the trucking industry, but as the miles passed, Derek began noticing odd details about his passenger. Travis kept shifting his duffel bag around, repositioning it every few minutes like he couldn't get comfortable. More concerning was the smell, a sharp, metallic odor that seemed to get stronger whenever Travis moved the bag. Derek had hauled enough different cargo to recognize various scents, and this one reminded him of the time he transported industrial chemicals that had leaked slightly during transport. Around the 1 hour mark, Travis started exhibiting strange behavior. He'd been looking out the passenger window when suddenly he turned to stare directly at Derek's profile. Not just a casual glance, but an intense, studying gaze that lasted uncomfortably long. When Derek would glance over, Travis would immediately look away, but Derek could feel those eyes on him again within minutes. The CB radio crackled occasionally with chatter from other drivers, but every time someone came on the channel, Travis would reach over and turn the volume down without asking. He claimed the static hurt his ears, but Derek noticed Travis seemed particularly nervous whenever another trucker mentioned their location or direction. Things took a disturbing turn when they were about 30 miles from North Platte. Matthias suddenly became very specific about where he wanted to be dropped off. Pulling out a crumpled piece of paper with what looked like hand-drawn directions. "Actually, I don't need to go all the way into town," Travis said, studying his makeshift map. "It's a truck stop right off exit 177. Just drop me there and I can figure out the rest." Derek knew exit 177. It wasn't a truck stop. It was an abandoned rest area that had been closed for over 2 years due to budget cuts. The parking lot was cracked and overgrown, and the building had been boarded up. No legitimate reason existed for anyone to want to go there, especially at 4 a.m. Derek's unease intensified when Travis started reaching into his duffel bag more frequently, feeling around inside without actually pulling anything out. Each time he did this, that metallic smell would waft through the cab more strongly. Derek began to suspect that whatever was in that bag wasn't clothes or personal belongings. As they approached exit 177, Travis became increasingly agitated, constantly checking his watch and peering ahead through the windshield. When Derek started to pass the exit, Travis grabbed his arm. "No, this is it. This is where I need to get out." Derek reluctantly took the exit, following the dark access road to the abandoned rest area. The place looked even more desolate than he remembered. Broken streetlights, weeds growing through pavement cracks, and that boarded-up building sitting like a tomb in the darkness. Travis immediately grabbed his duffel bag and opened the passenger door before Derek had even come to a complete stop. "Thanks for the ride, man. Really appreciate it." But instead of walking toward the road like someone planning to continue hitchhiking, Travis headed directly toward the abandoned building, disappearing into the shadows behind it within seconds. Derek sat in his idling truck for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Every instinct screamed at him to leave immediately, but curiosity and concern kept him there. What if Travis was in some kind of trouble? What if he needed help? Finally, Derek's survival instincts won over his conscience. He put the truck in gear and drove back to the highway as quickly as possible, not stopping until he reached the next legitimate truck stop 40 miles down the road. Derek finished his run to Chicago without incident, but he couldn't shake the memory of that ride. 3 weeks later, while checking news websites during a layover in Denver, he stumbled across a story that made his hands tremble as he read it. The article described how authorities had discovered the remains of 2 missing hikers in a wooded area behind the old rest stop at exit 177. The bodies had been there for several weeks, and investigators suspected foul play. What struck Derek most was the timeline. The hikers had disappeared just days before his encounter with Travis. Derek never reported his suspicious passenger to authorities. He had no concrete evidence linking Travis to the crime, and he'd already violated company policy by picking up a hitchhiker in the first place. But he also knew he'd never give another ride to anyone under any circumstances. Even now, years later, Derek still runs that same route through Nebraska. But he drives past every single person he sees on the roadside, no matter what the weather conditions or how desperate they might appear.